Before we dive into this story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about loss, disappearance, and the lengths one family would go to find the truth, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The case we're about to explore involves a tragedy that haunted one family for 2 decades, until a single photograph arrived that would shatter everything they believed about the night 5 children vanished forever. Margaret Walsh had barely slept in 20 years. Not since that December night in 1952 when flames consumed everything she thought she knew about her family. The official report said the fire started from an electrical fault in the kitchen. The fire department claimed the bodies of her 5 youngest children, David, 14, Emily, 12, Thomas, 10, Sarah, 8, and little Michael, just 6, had been completely consumed by the intense heat. But Margaret never believed it. How could 5 children vanish without a trace, leaving not even bones behind? She had already lost her husband Patrick in a factory accident 2 years earlier, raising their 10 children alone in the 2-story farmhouse outside Buffalo, New York. The older children, James, 19, Mary, 17, Catherine, 16, Robert, 15, and Helen, 13, had escaped the blaze, but the younger ones were supposedly lost to the flames that night. Margaret's nights were filled with questions that gnawed at her soul. Why had the phone lines been cut just before the fire? Why had a man been seen near their property earlier that evening asking strange questions about the children? Why had the fire department taken so long to respond, claiming their truck had broken down when neighbors reported seeing it functioning perfectly just hours before? These questions became Margaret's obsession, her reason for staying awake, for searching, for never accepting what everyone else had accepted as tragic fate. The night of December 22, 1952 had started like any other winter evening in western New York. The older children were home for winter break, the house filled with the warmth of bodies and the smell of Margaret's beef stew. A harsh wind rattled the old windows as snow began to fall, coating the world in a blanket of white that would soon turn to ash. The children had gathered in the living room, the older ones helping the younger with homework, while the radio played softly in the background. Emily was teaching Sarah to braid her long dark hair, while David helped Michael with his arithmetic. Thomas sat by the fire, reading a book about ships and dreaming of the ocean he'd never seen. It was Helen who first smelled the smoke. She called out to James, who discovered the kitchen engulfed in flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the old wooden structure. James, Mary, Catherine, Robert, and Helen made it out through the front door, screaming for the others to follow. But in the chaos, the smoke, and the panic, the 5 youngest children were never seen emerging from the house. Margaret had been at the market, buying supplies for Christmas dinner. She returned to find her world burning, her older children standing in the snow, sobbing as they watched everything they owned turn to ember and ash. The fire burned so hot that by morning the house was reduced to a smouldering foundation. The authorities conducted what they called a thorough search of the ruins, but found no bodies, no bones, nothing to indicate that 5 children had perished in the blaze. For 20 years, Margaret Walsh became a woman possessed. She hired private investigators, spent her life savings, and traveled across 3 states looking for any sign of her missing children. She placed advertisements in newspapers across the country, offering rewards for information. She visited psychics, followed false leads, and pursued every rumor that reached her ears. The older children tried to move on, to build lives around the gaping wound of that night, but Margaret refused to mourn. "They're alive," she would say, her eyes fierce with determination. "I know they're alive. Mothers know these things." She kept their rooms exactly as they had been, clothes laid out on beds, toys gathering dust on shelves. Every Christmas, she set places at the table for all 5 missing children, certain that this would be the year they would come home. The authorities had long since closed the case, dismissing Margaret's suspicions about the cut phone lines and the mysterious man as the desperate fantasies of a grieving mother. But Margaret had documentation, photographs, witness statements that she had gathered over the years. She had built an entire case file that filled 3 large boxes in her living room. News reporters occasionally featured her story on slow news days, portraying her as a tragic figure clinging to impossible hope. Friends stopped visiting, unable to bear the weight of her unwavering belief. Even her surviving children began to distance themselves, torn between loyalty to their mother and the need to process their own grief. But Margaret Walsh had seen things, had instincts, had collected pieces of evidence that told a story different from the official narrative. She had never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, her 5 children were living lives beyond her reach. Then, on a cold February morning in 1972, exactly 20 years and 2 months after the fire, a manila envelope with no return address appeared in Margaret's mailbox. Inside was a single black and white photograph, slightly faded but clear enough to stop her heart. The photo showed a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, standing in front of what appeared to be a mountain landscape. He wore a checked shirt and had a beard, but his eyes were unmistakable. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at the image. Those were David's eyes, the same deep-set, intelligent gaze that had followed her around the kitchen when he was 14, helping her prepare dinner for the family. The same slightly crooked nose from when he had fallen off his bicycle at age 10. The same dimple in his left cheek when he smiled. On the back of the photograph, in unfamiliar handwriting, were 4 words that sent shivers down her spine. "We are watching you." Margaret called a family meeting that very day. For the first time in years, all 5 of her surviving children gathered in the living room where they had spent so many evenings before the fire. James, now a successful accountant with a family of his own, was skeptical. Mary, who had become a nurse, tried to approach the situation with medical reason. Catherine, Robert, and Helen, each dealing with their own complicated grief, looked at the photograph with mixtures of hope and fear. But Margaret's conviction was unshakable. This was proof that David was alive, which meant the others might be alive too. She announced her intention to hire a new private investigator to pursue this lead with every resource at her disposal. For the first time in 20 years, she felt she had a direction, a purpose beyond the endless, aimless searching that had defined her existence. The private investigator Margaret hired was a former FBI agent named Thomas Mitchell, a man whose reputation for solving cold cases was matched only by his willingness to take on difficult, emotionally charged assignments. Mitchell began by having the photograph analyzed by experts. The paper, the chemical composition of the photograph itself, the style of development, everything pointed to the photo being taken sometime in the late 1960s. The mountain landscape in the background was identified as potentially being in Colorado or Wyoming, based on the distinctive rock formations visible in the distance. Mitchell's investigation revealed something that both terrified and energized Margaret. There had been similar fires in other states around the time of the Walsh fire. Houses with large families had burned under suspicious circumstances, always with children reported missing and no bodies found. In Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Tennessee, Mitchell uncovered reports of fires where phone lines had been cut, where fire departments had experienced mysterious delays, where children had vanished without a trace. Most disturbing were the witness accounts Mitchell managed to uncover through painstaking research. A truck driver who had been working the route near the Walsh farm in 1952 recalled seeing a large truck leaving the property around 2 a.m. on the night of the fire, hours before the fire had been reported. A retired telephone company employee remembered being called to fix lines that had been cut with what appeared to be precision equipment, not natural damage. A former fire department volunteer admitted under pressure that they had been instructed to conduct only a cursory search of the ruins. Mitchell's investigation was painting a picture of a coordinated operation, something far more sinister than a simple house fire gone tragically wrong. As Mitchell's investigation deepened, Margaret found herself pulled into a world she had never imagined existed. The detective had uncovered what appeared to be a network, possibly connected to organized crime or something even more structured. There were documented cases of children being taken from families, disappearing into what some referred to as redistribution networks. These networks, according to Mitchell's sources, specialized in relocating children to new families, sometimes across international borders. The photograph of the man who looked like David might not have been a coincidence or a cruel joke. It might have been a message, a signal, or even a deliberate leak from someone within the network who wanted the truth to come out. Margaret accompanied Mitchell on several trips, visiting witnesses, examining records, and slowly piecing together what might have happened on that December night 20 years ago. In a small town in Wyoming, they found a woman who remembered 5 children arriving at a local orphanage in 1953 under suspicious circumstances. The children had been traumatized, unable or unwilling to speak about their past. They had been quickly adopted by different families, their records sealed immediately afterward. But the woman, who had been a young worker at the orphanage, remembered specific details. A girl with long dark hair who braided it constantly, a boy who drew ships obsessively, a younger boy who solved math problems in his head, a girl who sang lullabies to the others, and the youngest, who rarely spoke but had an uncanny ability to fix broken toys. Margaret's heart raced as she heard these descriptions. Could these have been her children? Had someone orchestrated an elaborate kidnapping using the fire as cover? The woman pulled out a faded ledger showing entries from late 1952 and early 1953. 5 children, no last names, no origins listed, adopted within months of their arrival. The breakthrough came when Mitchell managed to track down 2 of the adoptive families. The first, a couple in Montana, had raised a boy they named John Miller. When Margaret saw the photograph Mitchell had obtained, her breath caught in her throat. The man in his 30s bore an unmistakable resemblance to how she imagined Thomas would have grown to look. The second family, in Oregon, had adopted a girl they called Susan Peterson. The photograph of this woman showed Sarah's distinctive bone structure, her mother's eyes staring back from a stranger's adult face. But approaching these individuals would require delicate handling. They had lived their entire adult lives with different identities, possibly unaware of their true origins. Margaret found herself facing an impossible choice: pursue the truth and potentially destroy the lives these people had built, or remain silent and live with questions forever unanswered. Mitchell advised caution, suggesting they gather more evidence before making contact. But Margaret had waited 20 years. Every instinct in her body screamed that her children were alive, living different lives, possibly unaware of their true identities or the family that had never stopped looking for them. The investigation revealed something else that chilled Margaret to the bone. The man who had been seen asking questions about the children the day before the fire had been an agent of sorts, someone connected to these networks. He had been identifying families with multiple children, particularly those in isolated areas or difficult circumstances. The Walsh family had been targeted, assessed, and selected. The fire had been the method of extraction designed to provide cover for what was essentially a mass kidnapping operation. Margaret learned that similar patterns had occurred in multiple states, always with similar consequences: fires, missing children, no bodies found, and families left to grieve. The confrontation Margaret had both dreaded and longed for came when Mitchell finally located the man from the mysterious photograph, the one who resembled David. His name was now Robert Davidson, and he lived in Colorado with a wife and 2 teenage children. Mitchell had made contact through intermediaries, explaining only that there were questions about his origins that needed to be addressed. When Margaret first saw him in person sitting across from her in a Denver coffee shop, she had to grip the table to keep from sobbing. This was her son, 20 years older, weathered by life, with a beard and lines around his eyes, but unmistakably David. Robert Davidson listened with growing shock as Margaret and Mitchell presented their evidence. Photographs, documents, witness statements, the timeline of his arrival at the Wyoming orphanage in 1953, details about the fire that had claimed the lives of 5 children who had never been found. Robert's hands shook as he looked at photographs of the Walsh family before the fire. His younger self looked back at him, frozen in time at 14 years old. Memories began to surface, fragmented and confused. A woman singing while cooking, the smell of wood smoke and beef stew, children laughing, snow falling. But these memories were mixed with others. Being told his family had died, that he was lucky to have survived, that he needed to forget the past and embrace a new life. The conversation lasted hours, filled with tears, questions, and slowly emerging truths. Robert admitted that he had always felt something was missing, that his earliest clear memories began at the orphanage, that he had nightmares about fire and faces he couldn't place. He agreed to help find the others. He agreed to undergo DNA testing, though Margaret already knew in her heart that this was her son. As the truth unraveled, the scope of what had happened became horrifyingly clear. The network that had taken the Walsh children had been operating for decades, orchestrating what were essentially child trafficking operations disguised as tragic accidents. Houses would burn, boats would capsize, cars would plunge off cliffs, and children would disappear, only to resurface in new families with new identities. The operation had been designed with careful precision, selecting families that had too many children, not enough resources or circumstances that would make the sudden loss of children, unfortunately, plausible. Margaret learned that the network had specific profiles they targeted: large families in rural areas, single parents struggling financially, families dealing with recent tragedies or relocations. The Walsh family had been identified months before the fire. Patrick's death had made Margaret a single mother of 10 children, struggling to maintain a farm and raise her family. To the network, this had made her children vulnerable, available. The fire had been meticulously planned. The cut phone lines ensured they couldn't call for help. The delayed fire department response gave ample time for the extraction. The extreme heat of the accelerated fire was designed to destroy evidence. Most chilling was the realization that someone within the local community had been part of this network, providing information, ensuring cooperation, manipulating the investigation. Over the years, millions of dollars had changed hands in this operation, with children essentially being sold to families willing to pay substantial sums for quick, quiet adoptions. The network had connections to corrupt officials, complicit social workers, and falsified documentation systems that spanned multiple states. Each child was carefully placed, their past erased, their futures rewritten according to the needs and desires of their new families. One by one, Mitchell and Robert helped locate the other 4 children. Emily had become Elizabeth Turner, a teacher in Idaho, living with the woman she called mother and raising 2 children of her own. Thomas was now Michael Rodriguez, a software engineer in California, married to a woman he'd met in college and father to a young daughter. Sarah had been renamed Jennifer White, living in Vermont as a successful artist, her early memories of trauma channeled into her work. And Michael, the youngest, had become Christopher Anderson, living in Alaska, working as a fishing boat captain, his early memories of snow and fire mixing with the vast wilderness that had become his home. Each reunion was emotional, complex and different. Some, like Robert, had always felt something missing and welcomed the truth despite its pain. Others, like Emily, struggled to reconcile the family she had built with the family she had lost. Thomas had memories that had haunted him, dreams of faces he couldn't place. Sarah had spent years in therapy dealing with trauma she couldn't identify. Michael remembered more than the others, perhaps because of his age, and had spent his adult life avoiding fire, large families, and the smell of wood smoke. The reunions were filmed, documented, shared with the surviving Walsh siblings who had spent 20 years mourning their lost brothers and sisters. James, Mary, Catherine, Robert, and Helen found themselves welcoming back family members who were strangers, adults who carried their siblings' faces but had lived entirely different lives. Margaret, now in her 70s, moved through these reunions with a mixture of triumph and grief. She had been right all along, but the cost of being right was staggering. Her children had lived 20 years without her, had built families, identities, and lives that couldn't simply be erased or returned to some previous state. The family that had been broken by fire couldn't simply be put back together. The legal ramifications of the discovery were immense, but frustratingly limited. Most of the principal figures in the network had died or were beyond prosecution. The trail of evidence had been carefully obscured over decades. What remained were low-level operatives, corrupted officials who had long since retired, and a system of deliberate document destruction that made building criminal cases nearly impossible. Mitchell managed to identify several key figures still alive, but proving their involvement in crimes committed 20 years earlier proved challenging. District attorneys in multiple states opened investigations, but many were frustrated by the passage of time, the death of witnesses, and the complexity of pursuing charges across state lines. Some justice was achieved. 3 former social workers who had facilitated falsified adoptions were charged with conspiracy and fraud. A retired fire inspector who had deliberately sabotaged investigations faced charges. 2 men who had been directly involved in the physical extraction of children were arrested, though one died before trial. The publicity surrounding the case led to the reopening of dozens of similar cold cases across the country. Other families came forward with stories of suspicious fires, delayed emergency responses, and missing children whose bodies were never found. A congressional investigation was launched into child trafficking networks operating within legitimate adoption agencies. New laws were passed requiring more stringent documentation and cross-state verification for adoptions. The Walsh case became a catalyst for broader reform, though Margaret found little comfort in policy changes that couldn't return 20 years to her family. The aftermath was a complex process of healing that would continue for years. The Walsh family, both the children who had lived through 2 decades of separation and those who had maintained their original identities, found themselves navigating relationships that defied simple categorization. Robert David struggled to exist in 2 worlds, as a husband and father in Colorado and as a son returned to a mother in New York. Emily Elizabeth found her identity as a teacher complicated by suddenly becoming a daughter again. Thomas Michael began therapy to process the cognitive dissonance of having 2 complete sets of memories, 2 families, 2 identities. Sarah Jennifer temporarily moved in with Margaret, trying to recapture something of the childhood that had been stolen from her. Michael, Christopher, had the hardest time, his memories of the night of the fire clearer than the others, his understanding of what had been lost more complete. The surviving siblings, James, Mary, Catherine, Robert, and Helen, found themselves grieving twice. Once for the children they thought they had lost, and again for the years of relationship they could never recover. Margaret established a foundation dedicated to locating missing children and supporting families of trafficking victims. She spoke at conferences, consulted with law enforcement, and spent her remaining years trying to help other families avoid the pain she had endured. The house was rebuilt on the same site where the fire had occurred, designed as a gathering place for the reunited family, with enough bedrooms to accommodate everyone when they wanted to come together. Christmas became an especially loaded time, both a celebration of reunion and a reminder of loss. The family instituted new traditions while trying to honor the old ones, creating rituals that acknowledged both the separation and the return. Not all relationships were easily restored. Some of the returned children felt more comfortable with their adoptive families, creating complex loyalties and divided allegiances. Others threw themselves into reclaiming their original identities, sometimes to the detriment of the lives they had built. Margaret, in particular, struggled with wanting to reclaim lost time while accepting that her children had become independent adults with their own complex lives and priorities. 25 years after the mysterious photograph arrived in Margaret Walsh's mailbox, the family gathered for what would be Margaret's final Christmas. She was 89 years old, her health failing, but her mind sharp and her spirit undiminished. All 10 of her children were present, some with spouses and children of their own, creating a multi-generational gathering that filled the rebuilt house with noise, laughter, and occasional tears. The story of the Walsh family had become something of a legend, featured in documentaries, true crime podcasts, and books about cold cases. But for the family itself, it remained deeply personal, a narrative of loss, persistence, and the complicated nature of recovery. Margaret died peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, surrounded by family, having lived to see all her children reunited. Her death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new chapter for the Walsh family, one where they could process their collective trauma without the driving force of Margaret's unwavering determination. The documentary that was eventually made about the case ended with footage from that final Christmas gathering, showing 3 generations of Walshes sharing a meal in the house that had been rebuilt from the ashes of tragedy. The older children spoke about the complexity of their experience, the joy of reunion tempered by the pain of lost years. The returned children spoke of divided loyalties, dual identities, and the process of piecing together their true histories. But they all acknowledged that without Margaret Walsh's refusal to accept the official story, without her decades of searching, without her bone-deep certainty that her children were alive, they would never have been reunited. The case spurred ongoing investigations into historical child trafficking networks and led to the location of dozens of other missing children who had been similarly displaced. It changed how missing persons cases are investigated and how unexplained deaths of children are handled. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the power of a mother's intuition, the danger of accepting official narratives without question, and the possibility that even the most devastating losses might not be final. The photograph that had arrived anonymously 20 years after the fire was never traced to its sender. Many suspected it was from someone within the network who had grown a conscience, someone who knew David's true identity and wanted the family to be reunited. Others theorized it was from one of the returned children themselves, possibly Michael, whose memories were clearest and who had spent years searching for his own answers before the formal investigation began. The truth of the photograph's origin remained one of the case's lingering mysteries, but its impact was undeniable. In final interviews conducted for the documentary, each of the Walsh children was asked what they had learned from their experience. Their answers varied widely, from practical observations about personal safety and the importance of documentation to philosophical reflections on identity, family, and justice. But they all agreed on one thing: the importance of never giving up, of maintaining hope even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, of trusting instincts that go beyond logical explanation. Margaret Walsh had taught them that love could transcend time, distance, and even intentional separation. She had shown them that persistence could overcome institutional failures, bureaucratic roadblocks, and carefully constructed lies. The Walsh family's story became a testament to both the darkness humans are capable of creating and the light that persistence, love, and truth can eventually shine into even the deepest shadows. As the documentary concluded, viewers were shown the rebuilt Walsh house, now bustling with activity as grandchildren played in the same rooms where 5 children had once been thought to have perished. The camera panned across family photographs displayed throughout the house, some from before the fire, some from the years of separation, and many from after the reunion. The final shot was of an empty chair at the dining room table, a chair that had been placed there for 20 years before the mysterious photograph arrived, and which now remained as a memorial to Margaret Walsh herself. Text appeared on screen encouraging viewers to support organizations working to locate missing children and to combat human trafficking. The Walsh family case had become more than just a story of personal triumph. It had become a call to action, a reminder that there are still families searching, still children missing, still cases waiting to be solved. The documentary ended with a simple request. If you have information about any missing person case, no matter how old or how cold, please come forward. Someone, somewhere, is still searching. Someone, somewhere, refuses to give up hope. Someone, somewhere, is waiting for that one photograph, that one clue, that one break that will bring their family home. As the credits rolled, viewers were reminded that this story, while unique in its specific details, represents just one family among countless others still searching for answers, still holding on to hope, still refusing to accept that their loved ones are truly gone. The message was clear: never underestimate the power of persistent love, and never assume that a closed case means the end of the story. Sometimes, 20 years later, a single photograph can change everything.